So in this video, we're going to take a quick pass about some basic conventions for setting up a project, saving a project, rendering the output, and then we'll also take a look at basic materials and really basic lights to improve the quality of our render. Now, typically when we get started with a project, we won't just jump into Cinema 4D and start throwing stuff into the perspective environment, but this exercise is really about just getting you up and running and becoming comfortable with the Cinema 4D and the 3D interface to where we're creating something that's not very precious or that we're not really invested in, but we've worked for a little while and we haven't saved anything. It's really important that when we save projects, really for any class or any project, that we're saving projects into a project folder. And so I'm going to jump out of Cinema 4D. I'm just going to hide Cinema 4D. And I'm going to create a project folder. Now, I'm going to save mine on the desktop so that I can easily access it and demonstrate, but you might want to save this in a more appropriate location. So I'm going to right-click and create a new folder. And I'm going to call this 3D Design. So this, I'll create a class folder first, okay? And this is where I'll save all of my 3D design projects. And inside this folder, I'm going to create a new folder. And this is going to be my intro to C4D or Cinema 4D experiment or project. Okay, so this is going to be the destination folder with which I saved this project into. So I'm going to jump back into Cinema 4D. I'm going to choose File, Save As, and I'll navigate to my class folder where I keep all this class content organized, into my project folder, and I'm going to call this, I'll refer to this project as just my intro or intro_test. Whatever the name, this is just a real basic experiment. We'll change the name of this when we submit the project here shortly. But in addition to the name, I'm going to add 01, or maybe I'll add 001. Okay, either way, I'll choose to add 01, and the idea here, the convention that I'm establishing, is that this is version 1 of the project file that I'm working on. So I'll hit save, and I'll just jump back into my project folder. So I have my intro to C4D project, and I now have my intro_test01.c4ds. This is the C4D project file that I have open. I'll jump back into Cinema 4D. Now, I've named my project 01, in fact I can see it up here, to really reinforce this idea of building a history into the project and incrementing my file names as I go. So for example, if I create some more geometry, so I'll just Command C to copy and Command V to paste, and I'll introduce some new geometry. I'll paste again, and I'll just shift click, and I'm just kind of playing around a little bit so you can see, some basic workflow here. But let's say I've modified this project in a way where I've made significant changes. I'll select this object, and just like I did when I was rotating this object in space, just like we were doing when we were moving the object numerically based on its position, we can also numerically reset or change its rotation. So I'm just going to set its pitch. That was the only value that changed from 0. I'll just zero out its rotation. So I've made some changes to my project. Now I'll choose File, Save. So that updates the project that I'm working on. And then I'm ready to make some more significant changes. And what I can do is choose File, Save Incremental. And what Save Incremental does, if we look up here at our project, we're now working on intro_test02. And if I just jump into my project folder and I look, I now have a second Cinema 4D project. It borrows the same naming convention, but it automatically incremented or increased the version number of the file that we're working on. So if I go back to Cinema 4D and I make some significant changes and I choose File, Save Incremental, now I'm working on version 3. So Cinema 4D really encourages this idea of making progress, meeting a milestone, saving what you're working on, and then incrementing that file so that you build in a history into your project. This is a really important habit to establish, a really important convention, that when we create a project, we want to create a project folder. I'm staying organized inside my class folder, so as we create new projects, we're going to have different projects inside, different projects folders inside the class folder. And inside our individual project folders, we're going to have lots of different files and lots of different assets. We'll talk about the kinds of assets that we'll generate in greater detail, but we'll start to look at one example, which are renders. So I'm going to go back to Cinema 4D, and right now, our environment, we have these basic pieces of geometry inside our scene, and ultimately, we're going to be creating different kinds of designs, different illustrations, different kind of constructions of objects. And one of the real benefits of working in a 3D environment, there's a lot of different benefits, but one of the biggest benefits is that if you create an illustration and the illustration is two-dimensional, if you want to change the perspective or kind of change things relative to the scene, we have to go back to the drawing board and modify things. But if we want a different perspective, let's say that we want to look from a top-down view, we just change our view and look at this in a different through a different viewport. I'm going to get rid of a couple of these objects and just simplify this scene a little bit. I'll go back to the concept of a kind of little tabletop game piece that could be 3D printed. I'll keep the marshmallow here for part of the demo here in a moment as well. But I have my basic geometry inside the scene, and I can look at it from different perspectives. Now, this is the preview of the scene, and what we really want when it comes to 3D models is that we would either output our 3D model to maybe a game engine where we would start to animate things and make it part of an interactive experience, or we would render things to a photo quality or to something that had a different aesthetic to it, so that we could see this object in kind of greater detail. And this is where we get into rendering. And so the basic render tools inside Cinema 4D are these three icons that are clustered together that have these little scene markers in them. So the first icon to the left is the render view. And you'll see that when you roll your mouse over in Cinema 4D, it does a pretty good job of giving you the quick key, the shortcut. And in my case, it's Command R. So if you're working on a Mac, it's Command R. It's Control R if you're working on a PC, or you can just click this button. And this gives us a quick render of our scene. Now, it's not too impressive right now because we have some basic geometry. We're under default lighting, and we have no materials to speak of, but we can already get a sense of the basic dimension and the basic volume of these 3D objects inside this scene, even though they look very similar, and these are just default conditions. The other rendering buttons, I'm going to skip to the render button all the way to the right. These are your render options, and so I'll just pop open the render options. I'm not going to change anything in here just yet, but I want to point out that there are different categories here. And by default, we're looking at the output tab, and in the output, my preset is set to 1280 by 720. So it's so when we render an image, it's going to be 1280 pixels wide by 780 pixels high. And our film aspect ratio is currently set to HD TV 16 by 9. That's all fine. I'm going to let this default, and I'm just going to close this. But once we start modifying our render settings, or once we output a render, just know that this is, by default, it's going to use whatever these presets are to output the image. And we can render to different kinds of files like JPEGs, PNGs, Photoshop documents, and a whole host of others. Okay, so we have the render preview that just renders our active view. We have our render options that come up, and then the button right in the middle is our render to picture viewer. Now the render to picture viewer is going to render based on whatever our render settings are. And then if we wanted to save this image, we could do File, Save As, along with a couple of different options. But for now, I just clicked on the render to picture viewer, and it outputted the render at 1280 pixels wide by 720 pixels high. In fact, it's giving me a little bit of output info over here. This is the current frame that we rendered, and this is the resolution of the frame. But for now, I'm just going to close this. Okay, and we'll get back to saving that in just a moment. But before I save this, I want to make a really quick pass and introduce some basic lights and some basic materials which will make this scene much more interesting. So I want to make a basic environment for our scene to operate within. And what I mean by that is that I want a basic floor. Now this is pretty typical unless you're going to composite something into a photograph or another scene. We want some kind of environment. So we'll build kind of a real simple studio floor. So if you notice when we preview our render, we're kind of floating in this really ambiguous space. We're in the middle of nowhere, right? You don't get a sense of the ground in the background. So what I'm going to do is, just to get a better sense of our environment, I'm going to create another cube. Now we could do this with a plane and some other objects, but I like to use a cube for this. And I'm going to set the height. I could do it with these widgets, remember, or I could just do it numerically. I'm going to set the height to 10 centimeters. So it's very thin from a height perspective, but there's still some dimension there. There's some vertical dimension, and I'm going to make the width bigger. And maybe I'll just bump this up to 2000 by 2000 centimeters, and I'll hit return. And for the sake of the demo, I think this will be fine. And as I'm orbiting around, you'll get a better sense of this as you gain experience in a 3D environment. What I'm looking for is I'm flattening out my view, okay, and I'm getting a sense that my floor is lower than my little character here, or my character is higher than the floor. My floor is set to 0, 0, 0, so it makes sense really to kind of move my character down rather than move my floor up. So I can see by flattening out my view, by just really kind of looking at it from a real side perspective, I can see that there's a gap between the floor and my little character here. And so I'll just want to move that stuff down just a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to select the body, and I also want to move the head as well. And so I have a couple of different options. I'll hold down the Shift key and select another object. And because these objects were right next to each other in the object manager, I can shift click them. So shift click. I can also click and drag to select both of them, just like we did when we deleted objects, and that will temporarily group these objects and allow me to move them. Now, if your objects are split, and I have body and head here in the object manager, and I got an object in between, if I hold down the Shift key and select, I get all three objects in a row. It's not what I want. If I select the body and I hold down the Command key on a Mac or Control on PC, and I click on another object, I can add selectively to that selection. That can be very helpful. So now I have these both selected, and I can just move this down. Now when I do, what I'm watching for is, you can see there's an orange highlight around my object, which gives me an idea of this object in space. And as I move it down, you can start to see that orange highlight, the edges become obscured by the geometry, the floor geometry. And so that kind of gives me a sense of, how close I am to the floor. And I'm just kind of looking for this to get pretty close to the floor, and then I can deselect. Now numerically, I should be able to set this to a value. I could do some quick math and figure this out precisely where that should sit, but I can just eyeball this, and that's pretty good. So I'll recompose my view, I'll render, and now you can see that I'm no longer floating in space. Now this still looks extremely boring, right? Because our lighting is not very effective. We still don't have materials or color or texture to our object. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But one of the things that's really going to make this a dynamic environment is by introducing lights. And so I'm going to introduce a light, and we'll take a deeper dive into lights a bit later. But for now, I'm just going to go up to this little light bulb icon. I'm going to click and hold, and this shows me the different kinds of lights that I can introduce into the scene. We have a standard light, target sunlight, spotlight, area, and so on. We'll define each one of these, but I'm just going to introduce a standard light into the scene. Now, just like our parametric primitives, our geometry, our cubes, and our spheres, whenever we introduce a new object, its default position is at 0, 0, 0. When we introduce a light, our first light object, you'll notice that our scene changes dramatically, and that's because the default lighting that's in our scene for arranging and modeling has been turned off, and so now we only have one light inside our scene. So I'm going to move that light up, I'm going to move it off to the side, and I'll move it to the front of the object, and now I'll give this just a quick test render, and you can see that my environment looks a lot different. Okay, it's a little bit more interesting, a little bit more dynamic. I have more information here in terms of the volume and some of the, the value change across the 3D geometry. Okay, and so now I have a simple point light inside my scene. And with a few quick changes, I just select the light and I look down here in the basic properties. I can change the color of the light here with this swatch. I can change the intensity and do a number of things, but really the only thing that I want to do is find this shadow, and where it says none, I'm going to turn on shadow map soft. We'll talk about the different shadows, but I'm just going to do a real simple soft shadow, and I'll render, and now you can see that really kind of changes the quality of the environment and the render and gives us a better sense of the space. So we just have some basic geometry, a really basic light, and that light I found in the general tab, which should default, I found the shadow and I changed it from none or no shadow, and I told that light to cast a shadow on any geometry that falls into the scene. Okay, I'll give that a quick test render. And now we have some basic volume to our environment. The last thing that I want to talk about in this presentation is just a real quick introduction to basic materials. We'll take a deeper dive into this in the next presentation and then again in our first project. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here, this big gray bar at the bottom of your perspective viewport. This is the material panel. And if I want a new material, I can create it a couple of different ways, but I'm just going to double click in this panel. When I do, I get this icon that pops up that says matte. So this is just a default material, and I get some properties over here, and I can adjust all of this stuff over here. But if I double click on the material, that will open up my material editor, and I can change this material title to whatever I want. I can call this simply, I'll call it white, or maybe white marshmallow or something. Okay, I'll call it white for now, real simple. Right now the color channel is selected, and every material has different channels associated with it, so I can click through these, but what I'm most interested in is the color. I have this color swatch up here, okay, and if I were to select it, I could scroll through. We have an HSV selector, we have an RGB selector. I like these hue selectors, but we have a color wheel, different kinds of selectors that should all look familiar. So depending on your flavor, we can set this up in a different method depending on your preference. So I'm going to go to this color wheel and make sure my HSV. So we have the hue here, or we can slide the hue around the color wheel, the level of saturation, and then the level of black. Okay, so I'm just going to set this to kind of a nice, real light blue, kind of white color. And so now I have this basic material. Now, if I want to apply this material to one of these objects, I can do this a couple of different ways. The best way to do this is to identify the object over here in the object manager that you want to apply the material to. And in this case, I have a very horribly named cube that represents my marshmallow. I'll select it just so I know where it's at. I'll click this material and drag and drop it onto the title, onto the name of the object, and you can see that it inherits that material. Okay, alternatively, I'll just double click in this gray bar to create a new material. Here's my new material. I'm just testing, so I'm going to call this red. I'll change the color of red and I'll close this. Alternatively, what I can do is I can drag this directly into the space and drop it on an object. It's a little less precise. And there's some reasons why we wanted to target the object over here, but just know that you can do this a couple of different ways. But we do need to be able to apply these materials directly in the object manager, particularly when we get to adding multiple materials to an object. So I'm just going to create one more material, and this is going to be my real basic ground type material, and I'll just choose like a kind of a real desaturated green. It's showing up kind of shiny, like a plastic, and that's because I have this reflectance channel turned on. You should too by default. So we have color channel. All these other channels are here. If we deselect them or uncheck them, you can see that that turns off. And now in my preview, it doesn't look as shiny as it had been, and I'll just throw that on for my ground material. Now, if I go back in and change this material, I'll go to the color channel, so I'm affecting the color. You'll notice that as I change the material, it updates whatever instance of that material is being applied inside this environment. Okay, but now, when I render my preview, see I get some very different results. Okay, so I've experimented with kind of moving stuff around inside my environment. I've set up some basic shapes and kind of experimented with some of the tools, introduced some lighting, and created some basic materials, all the while I haven't saved recently. So I'll choose Save and File, Save As. Excuse me, not Save As, File, Save Incremental. Okay, now at this point, just experiment and play. Come up with just real simple environment that utilizes lighting and materials. Make sure that you're saving it in your project folder, and when you're done, what we'll do is we're going to render to our picture viewer. Once you get a render, choose to File and Save As. When we save as, we can choose the file type with which we're rendering, and I'm going to recommend that until we have a compelling reason to do otherwise, we're just going to render the type as a still image, the format as a JPEG. We'll let things default to 8-bit. That's fine. Okay. And I'm going to say OK. Once we say OK, it's giving us the name and the location of the file. You can see it's defaulting to my project folder. So maybe I'll make a new folder and call this renders. And inside the renders folder, I'm going to save my file with this name. Now, I'm going to post this to the discussion board to get in the habit of working on something and posting so that other users can see what I'm doing, other students in the class. Whenever we post things for assignments and to the discussion board, we're always going to post our work in two different places. We want to get in the habit of, as we're working on our projects, posting works in progress. Okay, so this is a work in progress, but I'm going to include my name on the front end of the file. I'll use an underscore, my last initial, and another underscore, or I could use spaces, it doesn't matter. So I'm using my first name, last initial, and then I'm keeping my project title intact, and I'll save. Okay, so now when I hide Cinema 4D and I go to my renders folder, here's my render. I want to post this to the discussion board so that everyone can see the project that I'm working on. So what I'll do is I'll jump into Blackboard. I'll log into my class folder. I'll go to the discussion board, and in Unit 3, in the Intro to Cinema 4D, I'm going to create a thread, and I'm just going to call this Bill's Test, or Bill's C4D Test. and maybe I'll make a note that it's a WIP or a work in progress. Okay. Now I'm going to post my image to the discussion board, and if I just upload this as an attachment, I can attach the file. But if I do this and just set it as an attachment, I'll go into renders and I'll choose. I'll say this is an attached, get the spelling right, file. Dot, dot, dot. It's a work in progress, and I'll submit that. Okay, so now when I go look at this, you can see that I have this attachment here. Okay, I'm going to reply to my own post, and I'm going to continue to build on this. Now, that was an attachment. This is embedded. WIP. Same project, same file. I'm going to go find this insert image. Give myself a little line break here. And I'll insert image. Maybe. Come on. Let's see if Blackboard is not cooperating with me at the moment. Okay, so I was clicking on the image button. It wasn't responding for some reason. So all I'm doing is I'm just going to head back out. Okay, so Blackboard for a moment was not cooperating, and so I just took a step back. I could go back to the discussion board. I don't have to go all the way back out. I'm basically just reloading this post. I'm going to reply to myself. And again, this is just for the sake of the demo. I'll insert an image using this insert image tool. And now I'll browse my computer. I'll grab the same image and I'll choose that. I'm going to let everything else default. I'll hit insert. Okay. And if I want to include a little note here, I'll just select the image. I'll use my left arrow to back it up to get my cursor in front of the image. And you can see my cursor jumping around over here with the arrow keys. And so I'm hitting return to give myself a little bit of line space. So this is an embedded image. Which is better? Attached or embedded? And I'll submit. So you can see that the attached image, it's not as user-friendly, right? So we can click on it, we can download, and we can open in a new window. But if we embed it directly into our post, we can embed multiple images to show progress. And it's right here. It's really easy for people to see it. So, one of the basic conventions of interactive media is that you don't want content unnecessarily buried in clicks. And so if we can reduce the number of clicks it takes for people to get to your content, the more likely they're going to see it. So we want to get in the habit of naming our files appropriately and embedding JPEGs during our work in progress. We'll talk about how to submit our assignments, but just make a note, and I'll remind you of this through Blackboard and through announcements, that we're always going to be required to submit our work both through the discussion board as works in progress. As we're working on our projects, we'll just meet a milestone, something that we're proud to share, or something that we're interested, or something that maybe you have a question and you'll take a render or a screenshot and post it and ask a question along with an image. But as you're working, you're producing content, you're sharing that with the rest of the class. When you're done, you'll also post your final render, and then we'll submit it as an assignment. We'll submit it through the assignment submission link, which you'll find at the bottom of each lesson folder once the lesson is complete. So that's a really kind of high-level overview of Cinema 4D to get up and running. So jump into Cinema 4D, establish your project folder, experiment, and then post your work in progress, your experiment, to the Unit 3 discussion board using this embed technique. Make sure that you're using proper naming conventions, and if you have any questions along the way, you can post your questions here as well. The next set of presentations, we'll jump into our first major project, and I'll post some details of that in Blackboard here in the near future. So have fun with this project, and I look forward to seeing what you come up with.